Want to know about hurricanes in Virginia Beach? Is it something that you should even be aware of or concerned about? Well, that's what we're talking about today, and we're starting right now. Hey, my name is Sansalone, and I'm a real estate agent in Hampton Roads, Virginia. And if it's your first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button, hit the bell notification too, and then you'll get notified every time I do a video. But mainly hit that like button if you like my videos, because that tells the YouTube algorithms that I'm doing a really good job. But today we're talking about hurricanes in Virginia Beach. That's an often asked question people come to me for when they're moving here and they're trying to get a lay of the land and figure out what's going on. They ask me, hey, what's going on with hurricanes? Do hurricanes come? So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the history about the hurricanes in this area. Have they come? How frequently do they come? We'll also talk about what to expect if you do see a tropical system that might come to this area, and also how to prepare for these types of storms. So the one question I get asked a lot, well, Sam, do hurricanes come here? Well, the answer is sort of. It's a loaded statement. There have been a lot of storms that have come to this area over the last hundreds and hundreds of years. And you'll hear some stories about some past storms, like there was one Hurricane Hazel way back in the 60s that hit this area, as well as several others before then. There was even a hurricane in 1806 that came and created what's now known as Willoughby Spit, which is in the top northwestern section of Norfolk, right near the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. So hurricanes do have a history here, but what you might hear about in the news and across the south, southeast, as far as some of the major storms that have hit the nation, you'll see a lot more severe damage possibly in a lot of these other storms than what might end up happening here. That does not mean that the hurricanes don't matter or that they aren't actually packing some sort of a punch. I've got a link below, I'll drop below, to show you the past historical storms that have come to the Virginia Beach coast area and when they've come, what's happened when those storms have come. Then you can start seeing some trends as far as how often these storms come, how strong they are. One thing I'll mention about these storms, these historical storms, is that since I was born, I'm 36, I was born here in 1984, there have been about 20 storms that have come in this area since 1984, but those have had various strengths. There are some trends I want to mention about these storms that might give some context. There were 2 3-year time spans that had multiple storms that came. One was 5 storms in about 3 years, and another in between 2003 and 2004 we had 8 in 3 years also. So that was quite a few for a pretty short period of time. And so when that hits, when those amount of storms hit in that short period of time, it can create a mindset of storms hit this area a lot. However, in that 36-year time span since I was born, take away those 13 storms, there were only 7 other storms that had come here in the other 30 years. So if you do the averages, you might see that there's like one every year or two. But when it comes down to it, there are only 2 small sequences that have had a lot of storms, and the rest of the time there really hasn't been too much on a regular basis. Now, as far as those past storms since I was born, there are 2 specific ones I want to mention that have caused the most damage or really created the most stories and kind of historical impact to this area. One is Hurricane Isabel in 2003. I remember this one pretty well, as I was 19, and it was definitely the most significant storm I'd ever seen, and since then I have not seen one that strong either. Now, I will say though, strength is relative. So as far as like some of those category 5, category 4 storms that you might see in other places of the country that have hit, this one was a very strong hurricane. When it got to this area, it made landfall in North Carolina and headed north towards us as a category 2. But once the hurricanes hit landfall, that's when the power of the storm starts diminishing faster. And so once the eye got actually to us, it was closer to a category 1. And so we had, category 1 hurricane force winds with some gusts higher. But for the most part, you'd see a lot of areas that were measuring in the 70, 80 mile an hour wind range. People also often think about the winds as far as the biggest impact of hurricanes. However, there are other things that cause problems, not just the wind. In this area, it's not really the wind at all. It's the biggest concern. It's the rain. So I'm not going to get into the specific details of weather because I'm not a meteorologist, but I can give you the general gist of what storm surge is. Storm surge is basically the rise in sea level water from what's normal to what it is during a storm. So for instance, if your sea level is at 0 and you have a 5-foot storm surge, that means that the water that was at sea level is now 5 feet higher than it was before. It's almost like a displacement in a sense. So that water has somewhere to go, and it often goes inland. So that can lead to lots of flooding problems, especially as storm surge increases. So during Hurricane Isabel, the storm surge was 7.5 feet. So that created a lot of flooding problems, and also for Isabel, lots of wind damage as well. Billions of dollars of damage. In addition to that, Hurricane Matthew in 2016. This wasn't as much a wind event either as much as it was flooding. This is a big storm that stalled out over the area for a long period of time and dumped a lot of rain, and again, the storm surge created flooding problems as well. These were two anomalies. And what often happens with storms in this area is if you look at the map, you'll see where Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, it curves up and around towards the northeast. And then you see southeastern Virginia that's being blocked by North Carolina from the south. Well, a lot of these hurricanes come from the south and they go west, and they start curving west, northwest, and then eventually northwest and north. Then as other storms come from the west coast and push the storm back east, it eventually curves around. So what often happens is a lot of storms start out as being very strong down in the Caribbean. Then as the storms get closer to warmer water, getting closer to the coast, they start intensifying further in strength, meaning like it could be category 2, 3, 4, and sometimes 5. But then once the storm curves or goes inland and hits land, then that storm diminishes in strength pretty rapidly as far as wind damage. Or it curves up, and if it does hit towards Virginia, if it goes like further straight north and hits towards Virginia, the eye wall makes landfall before it gets to this area. So what you might expect as a stronger storm diminishes significantly by the time it gets to this area. So we're kind of land protected from that section of the water. So this is not to say that hurricanes aren't a concern or something to focus on here. It also means that you can kind of gauge based on the past experience of this area that there's a good likelihood that if hurricanes did come, they might become tropical storms or tropical depressions by the time they come to this area if they make landfall somewhere else. This doesn't mean that it couldn't change in the future, but it means that the likelihood of what you can expect can be based on what has happened in the past. So some of the questions you can ask yourself as far as gauging the severity of a storm can be things like this. If a storm might be coming to this area, first question can be, has it rained a lot recently? One of the things about Matthew, that when Hurricane Matthew came in 2016, is there was a lot of rain that came in the past month before that. So the water table here is already high. One of the reasons why you don't see many basements here. But once the rain came over a long period of time, that water table rose even further, so the water didn't have anywhere to go once all the rain came. Also, where is the wind going to be blowing? So hurricanes, because of their twisting motion, the winds can blow in different directions based on where the hurricane's going to be in a certain period of time. So the wind, if the wind blows from the shore inland, or like for instance Back Bay Wildlife Refuge, there is water near there, but if the water blows inland, it creates more of a flooding problem than if it blows outward towards the ocean. But from my own personal experience, I can say that of all the times I've seen tropical systems threaten to come or actually come, the strength of the wind normally doesn't go too much over like 50, 60 miles an hour. And like I said, Hurricane Isabel, Matthew, those were the two I'd say that had the biggest damage. Hurricane Isabel probably was the strongest winds I've ever seen, and that was probably over 80, 90 miles an hour for a short period of time. But most of the time it ends up being 50, 60 mile an hour with some gusts, and then it reduces relatively quickly once the hurricane gets to shore and starts to weaken. Then it becomes a lot of rain. But it can be kind of concerning when you're watching the news and you see the hurricane start developing in the Caribbean, and you start seeing the path, the trajectory, and the storm often strengthen. You see a lot of the national news talk about the big storms, and that becomes a big thing. It's easy when you're here to think, well, could that happen to us? And the actual reality is it could, but often what happens is by the time it gets to us, things change a lot to where the storm is not what it used to be or was in the Caribbean. So the next question is, should you be concerned about storms? Well, the answer is kind of loaded. I mean, yes, you should be aware and trying to prepare for the possibility of a tropical system coming to the area. The reality is that sometimes you might over-prepare and nothing happens. That has happened quite a bit. There are 2 times where me and or my family has evacuated to other areas because we thought that a hurricane might be coming. Both times, they never showed up. So how to prepare in this kind of situation? The evacuation option is there. The area has planned evacuation routes. If you do feel like you have to evacuate, or if you're required to evacuate, there are evacuation routes that you can take to get out of the area. And the area is also zoned, classified in certain zones based on the risk of certain types of storms. So if you live in a certain zone and you're being told that if you're in a certain zone to evacuate, then you have to evacuate. But again, this is very uncommon, and the likelihood of having to evacuate based on the storm coming is not too high, but keep in mind that it's still possible. But normally when you start seeing storms form, you have about 2 to 3, sometimes 4 days to prepare for what could happen. However, people that wait till the last minute usually rush to the store to get like supplies. So what I recommend is just have a grab bag of essentials if you do have to leave, or something to help you if you do lose power for a day or 2 days or several days. So if you do have to stay here, you're able to support yourself during the time. Another significant thing that can happen during the storms is power outages. Power outages can be pretty frequent, especially in certain areas where there are a lot of trees, down wires. That's another thing to be aware of, just like the flooding. And I'll drop some links below for some preparedness type tips, as well as the evacuation routes as well. Another thing I recommend that might be overkill in one sense, but if you do need to do this, then it's worth it, is to video the contents of your house, just going through and videoing everything. So if you do ever have to claim insurance for some significant unforeseen event, you have that as access, and you can show that you own the thing that you're recording. For the most part, a lot of the storms that do come here, it might sound like, if you had not been to an area that has tropical systems, this might sound concerning or frightening. My encouragement to you is, it's not nearly as frightening as it might seem. What gets hyped up is not often nearly as much as what actually occurs. So you might notice that the fear and concern level and the reality of what happens often are not consistent. And this is not to diminish the idea of storms coming and what could happen during storms. If you talk to someone in Isabel that was hit really hard by it, or Matthew and other storms, they'll have a concerning story to tell you. And there are a lot of stories of things that have happened in this area that were really, really bad in those storms. However, most of the area did not experience the same thing. That leads me to the flooding aspect, which is there are spots in Virginia Beach that did not require flood insurance, but when Hurricane Matthew in 2016 came, some of these areas flooded. This area was called Princess Anne Plaza and near Windsor Woods. They didn't have flood insurance. It wiped a lot of these houses out, and it was really, really, really bad. Since then, there's been some rezoning of flood zones, and now more places require flood insurance. With hurricanes, tropical storms, tropical systems, the flood zones do not indicate that if you live in an area that requires flood insurance, it does not mean that if a storm comes, you're going to have a flood. There are so many variables involving drainage, like I said, water level, and how often it's rained, and wind, in addition to other things that influence if there might be a flood or flooding of a street or being able to leave an area or not. I will mention, especially in Norfolk, that with hard rain, especially with lots of these storms, if the area is saturated for more than a day or two, there is a good chance that certain areas of Norfolk will flood the streets. So just because you're not in a flood zone doesn't mean that you're not susceptible to rain and flooding waters. And just because you are in a flood zone doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden going to have a significant, serious problem on your hands if it does rain that much. That's why I always encourage people, if you do plan to move in certain areas, to talk to neighbors and see what has happened in the past, especially with Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Isabel, because I think those are two of the storms that I would say would be best to monitor what has happened in that area to see what could happen in the future for similar storms. So that leads me to say that if you do live in Norfolk, especially like near Ghent, western Norfolk, make sure that you have a place to park your car, because the water can get high enough to where it can flood the engine, and so you want to make sure you're parked high enough off the ground. Just remember that the national news shows the worst of what has happened, and if this area ever gets publicized as being a place that's hit by a storm, that does not show the entire area in a perfect representation of what has happened. There's a possibility of storms hitting, but the likelihood of the severity of being significantly high is lower. Now, I love helping people talk through these processes and the intricacies of living in Hampton Roads. If you have any other questions and you plan on moving here also, please let me know. I'll drop my contact information in the description, and as well, there are some videos here if you want more information about the Hampton Roads and Virginia Beach area, and I will see you on the next video.